Don Salvatore Moretti thought he was a ghost. He ruled the city from a soundproof fortress of glass and gold, protected by an army of hitmen and a digital firewall that cost more than most countries' GDP. He had one rule: trust no one. Except for Elena. To him, she was just the desk girl. The one who booked his flights, filed his paperwork, and stayed in the shadows. He spoke about hits, bribes, and blood money right in front of her, convinced she was too small to ever be a threat. He was wrong. Elena wasn't just taking notes, she was building a digital cage. And when Salvatore finally made the mistake of making it personal, he didn't just lose a secretary, he lost his entire existence. This is the story of how the woman who held his coffee ended up holding his life. Don Salvatore Moretti lived within a glass crown that hovered 1,000 feet above the city's concrete heart. His penthouse was a masterpiece of clinical isolation, a soundproof fortress of obsidian and reinforced steel where the roar of the world was silenced by design. To the public, he was the ghost, a man whose signature never appeared on a contract and whose voice never graced a recorded line. He ruled his multi-billion-dollar criminal empire with the surgical precision of an engineer, believing that absolute secrecy was the only armor that truly held. But inside the soundproof cage, Salvatore was not alone. He was merely blinded by his own brilliance. Elena Vance sat at a minimalist workstation just outside the heavy, biometric doors of his inner sanctum. For 15 years, she had been the unseen hand that kept the ghost from fading into nothingness. While Salvatore paced his office, plotting the strategic restructuring of his rivals and the silent acquisition of city officials, Elena was the one who managed the digital pulse of his world. She didn't just book his private jets, she routed the shell company payments that fueled them. She didn't just manage his calendar, she synchronized the biometric locks, the military-grade encryption keys, and the silent alarms that made the penthouse a fortress. Salvatore treated Elena with the same detached utility he showed his high-end coffee machine. To him, she was an extension of the office technology, efficient, reliable, and fundamentally inanimate. He would lean back in his leather chair, a glass of 20-year-old bourbon in his hand, and discuss the removal of a problematic union leader or the laundering of $50 million as if he were alone in the room. He believed that because Elena never looked up from her screen, she wasn't listening. He believed that because she never questioned his orders, she lacked the capacity to judge them. "Elena," he called out, his voice a low, gravelly command that didn't bother to wait for a response. "The offshore transfer for the Port Authority bribe, is the Akron Alpha code active?" Elena looked up, her face a mask of professional neutrality. "It is, Mr. Moretti. I've updated the encryption layers. The master password remains the only bridge to those accounts." Salvatore nodded, turning his back to her to stare out at the city he considered his private chessboard. He didn't ask what the password was. He didn't need to. In his mind, he was the brain, and Elena was merely the keyboard. He didn't realize that by delegating the complexity of his security to her, he had handed her the very keys to his cage. He sat in his silent palace, convinced of his own invincibility, never noticing that the desk girl he ignored was the only person who knew the Akron Alpha code, the secret master password that could, in a single keystroke, turn his entire digital empire into a hollow, untraceable ghost. Salvatore Moretti thought he was the architect of silence, but he had forgotten that the person who builds the walls is always the one who knows exactly where to find the cracks. When the heavy biometric doors finally hissed shut and the private elevator began its silent descent with Salvatore inside, the penthouse didn't become empty, it became hers. The clinical silence of the office shifted, losing its predatory edge and taking on the quiet, heavy atmosphere of a library at midnight. Outside, the city was a sprawling carpet of electric diamonds, but inside the obsidian walls, Elena Vance was the only light that mattered. She didn't move immediately. She sat in the fading glow of her monitors, waiting for the building's internal security sweep to pass her station, a ghost waiting for the sensors to blink. For 15 years, Salvatore Moretti had believed she stayed late out of a desperate, servile loyalty. He thought she was merely catching up on the endless streams of shell company logistics and non-disclosure agreements that kept his empire afloat. He was right about the work, but dead wrong about the destination. Elena reached into the collar of her silk blouse and pulled out a small, teardrop-shaped pendant that hung from a thin silver chain. It looked like a piece of mourning jewelry, but as she pressed a microscopic indentation on its side, a recessed USB-C connector slid out with a soft, metallic click. This was the Acheron key, a custom-built hardware bypass she had spent 3 years and $500,000 of Salvatore's own untraceable dollars to commission from a black market coder in Tallinn. She inserted the key into a hidden port beneath her desk, a port she had personally installed during the penthouse's last security upgrade. On her primary monitor, the standard corporate interface flickered and died, replaced by a deep black terminal screen that hummed with a different kind of power. The military-grade encryption that shielded Salvatore's life, the firewalls he bragged were impenetrable, didn't even offer a whisper of resistance. They recognized the key. They recognized their creator. The screen began to populate with folders that didn't exist on any official server. They were labeled with a chilling, clinical coldness: political endorsements, uncut, Port Authority disposal logs, the Union Square payroll. Elena wasn't just a secretary, she was a digital historian of a decade and a half of human misery. She had captured the audio of every whispered death threat, the high-resolution scans of every forged deed, and the encrypted transcripts of every bribe that had built the glass fortress she sat in. She opened the root directory of a file titled the Moretti Archives. In the bottom corner of the screen, a small counter began to tally the contents as the backup synchronized with her private, off-grid cloud. The numbers blurred as they climbed, a relentless digital heartbeat. 500 files. 2,000 files. 8,000 files. Finally, the counter slowed and settled on a staggering figure: 15,742 items. Thousands of documents, each one a nail in the coffin Salvatore didn't know was already being built around him. There were photos of judges in rooms they shouldn't have been in, and GPS coordinates for concrete footings that held more than just rebar and stone. Elena stared at the number, the blue light of the archive reflecting in her eyes like a cold fire. Salvatore called himself the Ghost because he thought he left no trace, but he had forgotten that a ghost still casts a shadow. For 15 years, Elena had been that shadow, growing longer and darker with every sin he committed. The archive was complete. The evidence was absolute. Now, all she needed was the spark that would turn the Acheron key from a library tool into a detonator. She pulled the pendant from the port, tucked it back beneath her blouse, and began to pack her bag, the silence of the room now humming with the weight of 15,000 secrets waiting to be told. The sun was a pale, sickly disk struggling to pierce the perpetual smog of the city, but inside the penthouse, the light was as sharp and cold as a surgical blade. Salvatore Moretti stood before a holographic display of The Heights, a working-class neighborhood he intended to flatten to make room for his crown jewel, the Moretti Grand Casino. To him, the rows of brownstones and the vibrant community gardens were nothing more than structural rot in the way of his progress. He viewed the world in grids and profit margins, and the grid was currently being obstructed by a human element he found increasingly tedious. Elena entered the study with his morning file, her footsteps swallowed by the deep pile of the silk rug. She placed the dossier on his obsidian desk, her eyes grazing the glowing blueprints of the destruction he had planned. Salvatore didn't look up immediately. He was focused on a surveillance feed from a protest line at the neighborhood's edge. A young woman stood at the center of the crowd, her fist raised, her voice, though silent behind the glass, clearly igniting the people around her. She was vibrant, fearless, and possessed a familiar, sharp intelligence in her eyes. "The demolition is behind schedule, Elena," Salvatore murmured, his voice smooth and devoid of heat, which made it all the more terrifying. He finally turned, leaning against the desk, and picked up a physical folder he had kept separate from the digital archives. He slid it across the polished stone toward her. "I've spent 3 years and $20 million on the permits for this project. I don't allow obstacles to remain in my path. Not even when they share a last name with my most trusted employee." Elena's hand remained steady as she opened the folder. Inside was a high-resolution photograph of her younger sister, Maya. Maya was 24, a community lawyer who had spent her life fighting for the people Salvatore viewed as disposable. Beside the photo was Maya's daily routine, her home address, and the names of the cafes she frequented. It was a kill kit disguised as a memo. Maya is passionate, Elena said, her voice a flat, controlled line. She believes in the law. Salvatore let out a soft, dry chuckle and stepped closer, invading her personal space. He smelled of expensive tobacco and the metallic scent of a man who owned the air. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind Elena's ear, a gesture that was meant to be paternal but felt like the coil of a snake. He leaned in, his lips curling into a chilling, predatory smile. Passion is a luxury she can no longer afford, he whispered. You've been with me for 15 years, Elena. You know how this works. I've kept you close because you're efficient, and because you understand the value of silence. Now, I'm giving you a chance to prove that your loyalty hasn't been compromised by blood. He tapped the photograph of Maya with a manicured fingernail. You're going to handle your sister. You're going to make sure she stops these protests and disappears from the public eye by tomorrow night. If she doesn't. He paused, his smile widening to reveal the dark void behind his charm. Then I'll have my men handle her permanently. And you know better than anyone that when I clear a site, I leave nothing behind but dust. He stood back, waiting for the flicker of fear or the plea for mercy that usually followed his ultimatums. But Elena Vance simply closed the folder. She didn't beg. She didn't scream. She looked at the man she had served for a decade and a half, the man who had just put a price on her sister's life as casually as ordering a drink, and she felt the final thread of her restraint snap. I understand, Mr. Moretti, she said quietly. Good girl, Salvatore said, turning back to his blueprints, completely satisfied. He believed he had just tightened his grip on her. He believed that by threatening the thing she loved most, he had ensured her absolute obedience. He didn't realize that he had just handed the Acheron key its purpose. As Elena walked out of the soundproof cage, the 15,742 files in her archive were no longer just evidence. They were a death sentence. The point of no return had been crossed, and Salvatore Moretti had just made his final, fatal mistake. He had given the woman who knew all his secrets a reason to use them. The ice sphere clicked against the heavy crystal glass with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the oppressive stillness of the penthouse. Elena Vance moved with the rhythmic, mechanical grace she had perfected over 15 years, her hands steady as she poured 2 fingers of the rare, 20-year-old bourbon Salvatore Moretti demanded every afternoon at precisely 4 o'clock. To anyone watching, she was simply the perfect assistant performing a domestic ritual. But beneath the edge of the mahogany bar, out of sight of the security cameras, her left hand was busy with a different kind of alchemy. Tucked into the hidden pocket of her blazer was a specialized mobile device, its screen dimmed to a faint, ghostly blue. A progress bar crawled across the display with agonizing slowness, 82%. This was the payload, the logic bomb she had spent months refining within the Moretti archives. It was a digital ghost, a zero-day exploit designed to sit dormant in the heart of Salvatore's main server until it received a specific, encrypted SMS string. Once triggered, it wouldn't just steal his data, it would execute a total, irreversible wipe of his entire digital footprint. Bank accounts would vanish into the ether, GPS logs would be overwritten with garbage data, and the biometric encryptions that kept his fortress secure would collapse into a permanent lockout. Salvatore was in his study, his back turned as he argued softly on an encrypted line, his silhouette framed against the sprawling city. Elena could hear the rhythmic thump-thump of footsteps approaching in the hallway outside, heavy, purposeful, and unmistakable. It was Victor, Salvatore's head of security, a man whose instinct for betrayal was as sharp as the knife he kept strapped to his calf. Victor didn't trust silence, and he especially didn't trust Elena's. 88%. She picked up the silver tongs, carefully placing a single maraschino cherry into the amber liquid. Her heart was a frantic hammer against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of marble. The footsteps were closer now, the heavy vibration of the floorboards telegraphing Victor's proximity. He was 20 feet away. 10. 93%. The device in her pocket vibrated once, a sharp, hot pulse that felt like a brand against her skin. Error, connection unstable. Elena didn't flinch. She adjusted the position of the crystal glass on a leather coaster, her thumb grazing the screen of the device through the fabric of her coat. She forced the reconnect, her eyes tracking the shadow of Victor's large frame as it appeared through the frosted glass of the office door. 96%. The door handle began to turn. Salvatore laughed at something his contact said, oblivious to the digital knife being pressed against his throat. 98%. Elena stood tall, smoothing the front of her blazer as Victor stepped into the room, his cold, predatory eyes immediately sweeping the space, settling on her hands, her pockets, her eyes. 100%. Upload complete. Status, dormant. The device gave a final, silent haptic click. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, the carbon dioxide burning in her lungs. She picked up the tray, the crystal glass catching the afternoon light, and walked toward the obsidian desk just as Victor crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Your drink, Mr. Moretti," she said, her voice a calm, velvet stream. Salvatore reached out, his manicured fingers brushing hers as he took the glass. He took a slow, appreciative sip, the amber liquid glowing like liquid fire. "Perfect as always, Elena," he murmured, looking at her with a chilling, detached fondness. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You won't have to find out for long, sir," she replied, her eyes meeting Victor's suspicious gaze with a level of defiance that made the security chief narrow his eyes. Salvatore turned back to the window, sipping the bourbon that Elena had just flavored with the bitter taste of his own destruction. The logic bomb was now a ticking heart inside the fortress, waiting for the single word that would tear the glass palace down. Elena walked past Victor, the air between them thick with unspoken threats, knowing that the desk girl had just become the most dangerous person in the room. The countdown had begun, and Salvatore Moretti was drinking to his own funeral. The air in the penthouse had turned static, a heavy, pre-storm pressure that made the very oxygen feel thin. Salvatore Moretti was no longer the calm, collected ghost who moved with surgical precision. He was a man gripped by the jagged edges of his own paranoia. He paced the length of his obsidian study, his eyes bloodshot and darting toward the security monitors that showed the protests in the heights growing larger, louder, and more defiant. At the center of it all was Elena Vance, and every time her face appeared on the screen, Salvatore felt a phantom blade pressing against his ribs. Elena entered the room with a stack of physical transcripts, her expression a mask of granite, but Salvatore was already waiting. He didn't take the papers. Instead, he swept them off his desk with a violent, backhanded motion, sending the white sheets fluttering through the air like wounded birds. "You're distracted, Elena," he spat, his voice trembling with a low, dangerous vibration. He stepped into her space, his breath smelling of bitter bourbon and anxiety. "I told you to handle your sister. I told you to silence the noise. And yet, she's still there. She's still breathing. She's still screaming my name at the cameras." "Maya is stubborn, Mr. Moretti," Elena replied, her voice a calm, velvet shield. "But the pressure is being applied. These things take time. Time is a luxury I've run out of." Salvatore roared, his face reddening. He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing into predatory slits. "Or maybe it isn't time. Maybe it's loyalty. I look at you, and I wonder if I'm looking at my secretary or a mole. I wonder if the Akron Alpha codes are safe in the hands of someone who shares a bed with the enemy." He let out a short, jagged laugh that held no humor. "I've spent 15 years thinking you were the one person in this city I could trust. But I realize now I was wrong. Underneath the expensive suits and the clinical efficiency, you're just low-level help who got lucky. You're a desk girl who forgot her place because I let her sit too close to the throne." He turned his back on her, waving a dismissive hand toward Victor, who had been standing in the shadows of the doorway like a gargoyle. "Get her out of here. She's done. Fired. Scrub her access. Clear her out. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't plead. She didn't even speak. She simply turned to gather her leather satchel and her company laptop from the workstation. "Leave them," Salvatore commanded, not even bothering to look around. "The bag, the laptop, the phone, everything in this office belongs to me. You leave with exactly what you came with, nothing. You're forgotten, Elena. You're a smudge I'm finally wiping off the glass." Victor stepped forward, his heavy hand clamping onto Elena's shoulder with bruising force. He took the bag from her hand and the laptop from under her arm, his eyes gleaming with a cruel, silent triumph. He began to march her toward the private elevator, the staff in the outer office freezing in place, their eyes wide as they watched the fall of the woman who had ruled the penthouse for a decade and a half. Elena kept her head high, her gaze fixed forward as the elevator doors hissed open. Victor shoved her inside, the metallic clang of the doors sounding like the closing of a tomb. As the elevator began its long, silent descent toward the lobby, Elena stood alone in the center of the car. She waited until the floor indicator hit the halfway mark, away from the penthouse cameras, away from Salvatore's immediate reach. Slowly, she raised her left wrist. She tapped a specific sequence into her smartwatch, a 3-digit code disguised as a fitness app. The haptic feedback gave a sharp, singular vibration against her skin, a digital heartbeat that signaled that execution command had been sent. The logic bomb was no longer dormant, the digital fuse had been lit. Salvatore Moretti thought he had trapped her by taking her laptop, never realizing that the desk girl had already moved the entire world into the palm of her hand. The ghost had just thrown away the only person who knew how to stop the fire that was about to consume him. As the elevator doors opened to the lobby and the cold night air hit her face, Elena Vance didn't look back. She didn't have to. She knew that in precisely 60 seconds, Salvatore Moretti's empire would start to scream. The silence of the penthouse, once Salvatore Moretti's greatest luxury, had suddenly become a suffocating weight. He stood alone in the center of his obsidian study, the ice in his glass long melted into the amber dregs of his bourbon. With Elena gone, he felt a strange, jagged surge of adrenaline, the thrill of a predator who had finally pruned a dead branch. He reached for his ghost phone, the custom encrypted device that linked him to a network of untraceable contractors ready to do his bidding. It was time to silence Maya Vance once and for all. He swiped his thumb across the glass, prepared to enter the sequence that would authorize the contract. But the screen didn't flicker to life with the usual secure interface. Instead, a single, clinical string of text appeared against a void of black, access denied. Salvatore frowned, a small prickle of heat crawling up his neck. He tried again, slower this time. Access denied. He threw the phone onto the desk with a growl and turned to the workstation Elena had occupied for 15 years. He would do it himself. He logged into the primary server, his fingers flying across the keys as he bypassed the first 2 layers of security. He reached for the Akron Alpha portal, the gateway to his untraceable millions. This was the blood that kept his empire breathing. He typed the master password he had never shared with anyone but her. Account not found. His heart gave a sharp, painful thud against his ribs. Nonsense, he hissed into the empty room. He refreshed the page, his hands beginning to shake. He tried the Cayman accounts next, then the Swiss holdings, then the shell company in Panama. One after another, the screens flashed the same heart-stopping message, account not found. No data correlation. It was as if the money had never existed, as if the billions he had spent a lifetime stealing had been erased by a cosmic hand. Panic, cold and oily, began to churn in his stomach. He scrambled toward the mahogany bookcase, swinging it open to reveal the biometric safe embedded in the reinforced concrete wall. This was his fail-safe, $5 million in cash, 3 kilograms of gold, and a set of clean passports. He pressed his thumb against the glowing green glass of the scanner. The light didn't turn green. It pulsed a violent, angry red. System error. Unauthorized user. Open. Salvatore roared, slamming his fist against the steel door. Open, you piece of junk. He pressed his eye to the retinal scanner, desperate for the machine to recognize its master. The red light flashed again, rhythmic and mocking. System error. Biometric data purged. He spun around, the room suddenly feeling smaller, the soundproof walls no longer a shield but a tomb. He tried to call Victor on the internal intercom. Connection terminated. He tried to open the elevator to the lobby. Communication offline. He looked at the wall of security monitors, expecting to see his guards, but the screens were flickering, the images of his empire dissolving into static and snow. In the center of the static, a single window popped up on every screen in the room. It was a video file, date stamped 15 years ago. It showed a younger Salvatore, his face clear and arrogant, laughing as he handed a bribe to a high-ranking senator. Then it cut to a different file, a recording of him ordering the hit that had put his predecessor in the ground. Then another. And another. The logic bomb hadn't just deleted his future, it was broadcasting his past. Salvatore Moretti, the man who prided himself on being a ghost, was being hauled into the light, one pixel at a time. He fell back into his leather chair, the sound of his own heavy breathing the only thing left in the room. Every door he owned was locked. Every dollar he possessed was gone. Every secret he had buried was screaming to the world. The gatekeeper hadn't just quit, she had turned his fortress into his cage, and for the first time in his life, Salvatore Moretti realized that a ghost has nowhere to hide when the walls start to burn. The digital detonation began not with a bang, but with a synchronized chime across 10 million devices. While Salvatore Moretti sat paralyzed in his darkened penthouse, the Acheron key was completing its final, devastating cycle. Elena's logic bomb hadn't just erased his assets, it had redirected the high-speed fiber optic lines of his own servers to every major news outlet, federal database, and social media platform in the country. The ghost was being dragged into the sun, and the light was blinding. In the bustling newsrooms of the city, monitors that had been tracking weather and stock prices suddenly flickered and surged. Thousands of files began to stream onto their screens in a torrent of evidence that defied belief. It wasn't just speculation, it was the raw, ugly clockwork of an empire. High-definition video of Salvatore handing over bags of cash to the city council president played on a loop. Encrypted ledgers detailing disposal costs for union leaders scrolled across public billboards in Times Square. The anonymous data dump, titled simply The Moretti Chronicles, was so comprehensive that within 20 minutes, the city's infrastructure began to shudder under the weight of the truth. By the top of the hour, the fallout reached the highest levels of power. On every screen in the penthouse, Salvatore watched a live feed of the police chief being escorted from his home in handcuffs, his face pale and eyes downcast. 2 state senators issued frantic, tearful resignations before the FBI even reached their doors. The ghost had protected them all for 15 years, but now his shadow was a net, pulling them all into the abyss. Salvatore saw his own face, a high-resolution surveillance still he didn't even know existed, plastered across the crawl of every major network. The myth of his invisibility had been shattered, he was no longer a legend to be feared, but a target to be hunted. The betrayal, however, was not limited to the law. In the dark corners of the city, Salvatore's criminal associates, men who had sworn blood oaths of loyalty, were watching the same screens. They didn't see a leader anymore, they saw a liability. If Salvatore had been compromised to this extent, it was only a matter of time before the trail led to their doorsteps. The phone lines he had spent years encrypting were now silent, but the streets were beginning to hum. In the parking garages of his casinos and the backrooms of his clubs, black SUVs were speeding away as his captains scrambled to liquidate what they could before the feds arrived. One by one, the men who had feared his name began to make a different kind of calculation. They knew Salvatore was trapped in his glass fortress, and they knew he was the only one left who could testify against them. To the mob, he was no longer the ghost, he was a loose end that needed to be cut. Inside the penthouse, the silence was finally broken by the sound of a distant siren, then another, then a chorus of them, converging on his position like a pack of wolves. Salvatore looked at the wall of monitors, seeing the world he had built dissolving into a chaotic frenzy of arrests and fleeings. He realized then that Elena hadn't just fired a shot, she had rewritten the laws of his universe. She had turned his soundproof sanctuary into a beacon for every enemy he had ever made. The desk girl had stripped him of his mystery, his money, and his protection, leaving him naked in a room made of glass, waiting for the first stone to be thrown. The spiral had begun, and there was no one left to catch him as he fell. The soundproof glass of the penthouse, once Salvatore Moretti's shield against the chaos of the world, had become a transparent tomb. Outside, the night was alive with the rhythmic, pulsing glare of red and blue strobes reflecting off the low-hanging clouds. Salvatore stood in the center of his darkened office, clutching a heavy brass letter opener like a primitive dagger, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He reached for the wall console to engage the emergency lockdown, but the screen was dead, a blank slab of obsidian that mocked his desperation. He sprinted toward the private elevator, his expensive loafers skidding on the polished marble. He jammed his finger into the call button, but the golden ring around it didn't glow. Instead, a small, red text scrolled across the tiny display, "Service terminated by administrative override." Elena hadn't just locked the door, she had cut the veins of the building. He was trapped 1,000 feet in the air, a king without a kingdom, waiting for the executioners to arrive. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sound that the penthouse was never supposed to hear. It wasn't the sound of a door opening, it was the sound of the world breaking in. A series of muffled, synchronized pops echoed from the panoramic windows, the sound of hydraulic glass cutters and tactical charges. Salvatore shielded his eyes as the floor-to-ceiling glass, designed to withstand a hurricane, disintegrated into a million diamond-like shards. Black-clad figures swung into the room on high-tension ropes, their movements silent and predatory. The beam of a dozen tactical lights cut through the darkness, pinning Salvatore against his desk like an insect on a board. "Hands! Show me your hands," the command roared, amplified by the cold acoustics of the hollowed-out room. Salvatore dropped the letter opener, the metallic clatter sounding pathetic against the backdrop of his collapsing life. He felt the cold, heavy bite of steel as handcuffs were ratcheted tight around his wrists. His face was pressed into the obsidian desk, the very surface where he had signed death warrants and moved millions. The air smelled of cordite, expensive bourbon, and the ozone of a dying digital empire. As the lead agent hauled him upright, Salvatore's personal phone, the one Elena had left on his desk, vibrated. In the wreckage of the room, the screen flickered to life, its glow a sharp, neon blue against the dust and glass. A single notification appeared. Salvatore's eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and realization, fixed on the text. The message was from an unknown number, but the voice behind it was unmistakable. It read, "Your password was untouchable. You were wrong." Salvatore's knees buckled. It wasn't the weight of the federal agents or the looming prison sentence that broke him, it was the sheer, mathematical precision of the betrayal. He had given her his trust because he thought she was beneath his notice, and she had used that very invisibility to dismantle his soul. As they dragged him toward the service stairs, the only way out of a fortress that no longer obeyed him, Salvatore looked one last time at the screen. The ghost was gone, replaced by a man in handcuffs, while the woman who had held his coffee was now the only one holding the truth. The shadow had finally fallen, and it was longer and darker than he had ever imagined. The high-security wing of the state penitentiary was a world of flat, gray concrete and the rhythmic, soul-crushing sound of iron sliding against stone. For Salvatore Moretti, the man who had ruled a digital empire from a fortress of glass, this was a special kind of hell. There were no fiber optic lines here, no biometric scanners to command, and no encrypted satellites to whisper his orders across the globe. His cell was a 6 by 9 foot box where the only technology was a flickering fluorescent bulb that hummed with a maddening, persistent buzz. He sat on the edge of a thin, institutional cot, his manicured hands now rough and stained by the manual labor of the yard. He stared at the wall, his mind reflexively trying to calculate a way out, but there were no passwords for a steel door that only opened from the outside. The ghost had been granted his ultimate wish, he was finally invisible to the world, but in the most literal and agonizing way possible. He was a number in a system that didn't care about his name, his legacy, or the billions he had once controlled. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the blue light of that final text message, a digital ghost of the woman he had dismissed as low-level help. Thousands of miles away, the air was thick with the scent of salt spray and blooming hibiscus. Elena Vance sat on the deck of a modest white bungalow overlooking a turquoise cove that stretched toward an endless horizon. She wasn't wearing a suit or a uniform, she was dressed in a simple linen wrap, the silver, Acheron key, no longer hidden beneath her blouse but sitting openly on the table beside a glass of fresh lime juice. She opened her laptop one last time, the screen reflecting the peaceful movement of the palms. She wasn't looking at offshore accounts or hit lists. She was looking at a news report from the Heights. The Moretti Grand Casino had been officially scrapped. In its place, a massive community land trust had been established, funded by a series of anonymous donations that the government's best forensic accountants couldn't trace. New brownstones were being restored, and the community center, named after her sister, was already breaking ground. Elena watched a clip of Maya standing in front of the construction site, smiling as she spoke about a future where the neighborhood belonged to the people, not the predators. Elena felt a quiet, cool sense of peace settle over her. She had used Salvatore's untraceable blood money to wash away his stains, turning his ghost assets into solid bricks and mortar for the people he tried to erase. With a single, deliberate motion, she dragged the master archive, the 15,742 files that had been her life for 15 years, into the digital shredder. She watched the progress bar hit 100%, then closed the lid of the laptop. Salvatore Moretti had spent his life believing that power was found in firewalls and fear. He learned too late that real power lies in the hands of the people who see you when you think you are invisible. He had treated his secretary like a tool, forgetting that the one who manages your life is the one who can ultimately end it. He lost his world because he believed money was the only currency, but Elena Vance had proven that respect is the only one that doesn't depreciate. Salvatore thought Elena was too small to matter, but she ended up being the only one big enough to lock the cage. This leaves us with a choice. If you had the master key to a monster's empire, would you have taken the millions for yourself, or would you have traded it all just for the justice? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. While you're there, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell so you never miss another deep dive into the shadows of power and revenge. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.